tonight's topic is on one questioning and then looking through the evidence of whether the Bible is reliable. So we'll be looking through a lot of history tonight. I've done my best to try to not make it boring and dry. We've got videos in there. I've got some memes in there that I found. And so hopefully it won't be, it'll be hopefully very fascinating. So.
That's a good sound.
Ooh, awesome. Wonderful.
It's got a laser pointer too.
Ooh, wait, laser pointer? Laser pointer, cool. All right. Yes, bring in the cats. Up here. All right, so we have specifically 4 topics that I'm going to address tonight. This I'm going to be treating as an introduction to the topic of just even the Bible itself and what is it. So first we're going to be looking at what is the Bible? What do you have in your own Bibles when you bring them and you open them up? What is inside of it? Then we'll be talking about the topic of textual criticism. What exactly is that? Determining the reliability of the Bible. Then we'll be going through one of my favorite arguments, the historical criteria. There's 4 of them. We'll be looking through those and seeing how those will assist the reliability and our probability of looking at these ancient texts to say, yeah, I think that's reliable. And then we'll also be looking at a few other methods, although I won't be touching on them as much. We'll still address them just so you guys have an idea that there's more than one argument that can be made for the Bible. So first things first, what is the Bible? Is it a narrative? Is it poetry? Is it a book of rules? What exactly is it? Is it just fantasy and legend? Right? You'll hear that people will just say that, oh, it's just a bunch of myths and legends. Is it? Does it actually have any history around it? So first we're going to address what the Bible is not, in the question of what is the Bible. So is the Bible a set of golden plates that just fell out of heaven that we now have this beautiful book? No. There are other religions who believe this, but for us, no, that is not the case. Was it a book that was written in like the 1500s by some monks? Well, no. This was actually a lot older, and if we really look at it, we're talking about a book that's been in the process of being written for nearly 3,000 years. If I did my math right, it's about 2,000 or 3,000 years it took to write this book that you have in your hands. So no, it's not monks from the 1500s. We'll look at a few dates and things. And then is it just a real book? No, it's got a lot more than just a bunch of rules. This is by the Bible Project. This will address some of these questions, and they'll bring up a lot of topics that we will go a little bit deeper into looking at. But I will let the Bible Project people take it away.
The Bible.
Ooh,
it's one of the most influential books in human history.
It explores the big questions of why we exist.
It's inspired many people to do amazing things.
And confused many others.
And you've probably got one sitting around somewhere.
So, what is the Bible actually?
Well, the Bible is a small library of books that all emerged out of the history of the people of ancient Israel. And in one sense, they were just like any other ancient civilization. But among them were a long line of individuals called prophets. And they viewed Israel's story as anything but ordinary. They saw it as a central part of what God was doing for all humanity. And these prophets were literary geniuses.
Really?
Yeah, they expertly crafted the Hebrew language to write epic narratives, very sophisticated poetry. They were masters of metaphor and storytelling, and they leveraged all of this to explore life's most complicated questions about death and life and the human struggle.
So, there's a lot of different authors writing this book.
Yeah, and these texts were produced over a 1,000-year period, starting with Israel's origins in Egypt, then leading up to their kingdom with their first temple. But eventually, they were conquered by the Babylonians, who took them away into exile. Then, at a crucial moment in their history, many Israelites returned to their land. They built a second temple, they reformed their identity, and this is when the Jewish scriptures began to be formed into the shape that we have them today.
Okay, the Jewish Bible. What's in it?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called by an acronym, Tanakh. The T stands for Torah. That's Israel's 5-book foundation story. The N stands for Nevi'im, the Hebrew word for prophets. And this section consists of the historical books that tell Israel's story from the prophet's point of view. Then you get the poetic books of the prophets themselves. The K stands for ketuvim, the Hebrew word for writings. This is a diverse collection of poetic books, wisdom books, and more narrative. And the Jewish people believe that through all of these literary works, God speaks to his people.
Now, there were other Jewish writings being produced during this Second Temple period as well.
Yeah, a really diverse group of texts. And these too were highly valued in Jewish communities. And there was debate from ancient times about whether or not some of these should be considered part of their scriptures.
So, this is a lot of different writings over a long period of time. Why did they put them all together like this?
Well, altogether, these texts tell an epic story about how God is working through these people to bring order and beauty out of the chaos of our world. And it all builds up to a hope for a new leader who would come and renew all creation. And then the Tanakh concludes, and this leader never comes.
So it's an expertly crafted work, but it's missing an ending?
That's exactly right. Now, a few centuries later, a Jewish prophet comes onto the scene named Jesus of Nazareth. He claimed he was carrying the Tanakh story forward.
And so Jesus did a bunch of cool stuff, was killed, but his followers claimed he was alive from the dead.
Yeah, they said that Jesus was that long-awaited leader who would restore the world. And so his earliest followers, called apostles, they composed new literary works about the story of Jesus. They called these good news, or the gospel. They formed an account called Acts about the spread of the Jesus movement outside of Israel. And then they circulated letters to different Jesus communities all around the ancient world.
And they saw these writings as part of the scripture.
Yeah, the apostles wrote all of this as the fulfillment of that epic story found in the Tanakh. And they were continuing the literary genius of the Jewish tradition. They also believed that God was speaking to his people through these texts alongside the scriptures of Israel.
So that's the Old and New Testament. But what did the early Christians think of the other Second Temple literature?
Well, different groups had different views about some of these books, but we know they read them and valued these texts because they passed them along with the Jewish scriptures.
Okay, so we've got the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures. We got these other Second Temple period works. Then the writing of the apostles about Jesus. And that's a lot of literature, so what's in my Bible?
So the Christian movement has taken different forms over 2,000 years, and from the beginning, all Christians recognized the Tanakh and the New Testament as scripture. And for centuries, much of the Second Temple literature was read as part of the biblical tradition. The Catholic Church eventually made it official and called some of the books from this collection the Deuterocanonical books. Some Orthodox churches used even more books from this Second Temple literature. And then in the 1500s, during the Reformation, Protestant Christians wanted to go back to the oldest writings of the prophets and apostles, so they accepted only the Old and New Testaments.
Okay, I think I got it. But how does a collection of books produced over 1,000 years by all these different authors tell one unified story?
Yeah, that's the question we'll address in our next video.
Hey, I'm John.
And I'm Tim.
This is the Bible Project.
There we go. All right, so that's the Bible Project. They've got a lot more videos on that. If you like their content, you're welcome to watch them. As of tonight, we will only be addressing the Old and New Testament. I will not be addressing the intertestamental books for any Catholics or Greek Orthodox that might happen to be in the room. So this is a bit of an overview. I've made an arbitrary 6 parts. You can really divide it up in many different ways. I decided 6 just because I figured it'd be pretty easy to divide the Bible into that way. We have our 2 sections, our Old Testament and our New Testament. Old Testament's got the law, the prophets, and the writing. The New Testament, I'm putting Acts and the Gospel together, as well as then we have the letters of the apostles and the Revelation. So let's go into a little bit more detail. Old Testament. So we've got these 3 these 3 sets of books, a part of the Tanakh, which you saw them talk a little bit about here. What's important to realize and to know is that the Old Testament is not a series of laws. It is a story. Above all other things, it is a story. And so what we have here is we have the Torah, and this is the beginning of the story. These are our first 5 books of our Bible. I'll go through a list if you're curious of what books belong in which categories. I will have a slide on that. But for right now, the Torah talks about the creation of the world and the origin story for the Israelites, which Jesus was Jewish, and so we're interested in their story. The Nevi'im is the continuation of that story. It includes the historical books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, as well as containing the 3 major prophets and the 12 minor prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the minor 12, which all have the fun, weird names like Zephaniah and Habakkuk. Over here is the last category. This category, the best way to think of it is kind of like a kitchen junk drawer. They kind of just throw everything in there. You have tons of different categories. You have the Psalms in there. So we have a type of worship and praise kind of songs. We have Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. So we have wisdom literature, large collection of various different works in that category. Our next section is these three parts. We've got the gospel. In this one, I am including also Acts in my, you could break it into 4 categories right here if you wanted to say the gospel, the Acts of the Apostles, the letters, and the Revelation. But for simplicity, I'm just putting the gospel because it is the good news about Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. Then we have the letters, which are letters written by various of the disciples of Jesus, writing to various other churches, typically giving them and instructing them on wisdom and correcting them on things that they're doing wrong. And then we have the Revelation. I put an I there. It's a vision that the Apostle John had of seeing the return of Christ in the end of times, when judgment will happen, when everyone will be resurrected, everyone will be gathered, judged, and our final destinations may be determined. So here's a list of every book that fits in every category. We got 5 books in the Torah, nice and simple. First 5 in there are Bibles. Now, where our Bibles, modern day Bibles, will differ from the ancient Jewish ordering, and now remember, this ordering of the Old Testament is what Jesus had in his day. Okay, so when Jesus, in Jesus' day, in like Luke, Jesus might refer to as the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Do you see what he's doing there? The law, the Torah, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and then the Psalms, which is the first book of the kitchen junk drawer, the writings. So when Jesus is saying then the law and the prophets and the Psalms, he's saying, well, in the entire Hebrew Bible, right? So this is in Jesus' ordering, not our modern day ordering. Our modern day ordering likes to order it in chronological order. So for example, here I can use the laser pointer. Between Judges and Samuel, you'll find the book Ruth in our modern Bibles. The reason is, Ruth, in the very first lines of Ruth, it says, in the day of the judges. Oh, right. So right during the time of the judges. So our Bibles will say chronologically, Ruth fits right in between the two. The ancient order didn't do it that way, but our modern order does it that way. So the Nevi'im has one other detail I'll mention. The Nevi'im has our historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. These are narrative stories talking about what happens to Israel as a, let's see if I can do this, enter the promised land, become tribes, get a kingdom, and then split a kingdom. And so that's kind of our narrative stories. And then we have our major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then our minor prophets, Hosea, all the way through Malachi. Now, some of you may notice, wait a second, why is Daniel over in the Ketuvim? Daniel's a prophet, right? In our modern Bibles, we tend to look at Daniel as the 4th of the major prophets. But Daniel was a book written a little bit on the later end toward that prophet, or toward the time that Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel arrived. And it is typically viewed, there's actually, I should say, a specific reason why there's 3 and then 12. Does anyone know why we have 3 and 12? We have 3 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. Go ahead.
Trinity, Apostle.
Close. The apostles is actually, the Trinity is, I would say, off. The apostles is very close. What were the apostles based off of? Why 12 apostles?
12 tribes.
The 12 tribes of Israel. And maybe we have, I don't know, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 3 patriarchs. And so, right, so we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. And so even the prophet, the section called the prophets, is based off of our Torah series, specifically focusing on Genesis right here. So there's a lot of this pattern. That's why Daniel was not added to them, because that would make 4, and that kind of gets weird, and they're like, let's do the 3. But looking at the Ketuvim, we do have some really weird books. We've got love poetry here. We've got some wisdom literature. And then we've got some narrative with Ezra and Nehemiah. We've got a summary of the entire Bible with Chronicles. It's just kind of really weird. We have a bunch of stuff in there. But that is the nature of our Bibles today. These are all of the same books that you find in your Bible, just in a different order. Let's see. New Testament. I'm keeping the traditional order that we have in our Bible, so this one should be easy. Some of you can sing little songs that have the entire New Testament in order and everything. So you'll also notice right here I've included Luke and Acts together, because if you start Acts, what is the author of Acts say? In my former book, I talked about these things. Well, wait, what former book? Oh yeah, Luke. So essentially it's the second part of his 2-book series that he did on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and what the apostles did during their lifetime. Revelation I gave in its own category because it's really, really, really distinct from any other book that we find in the New Testament. Revelation specifically is this incredibly dense, symbolic, and very poetic story from a vision that John had. And it is thoroughly entrenched in the Torah and the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim. If you have all of this memorized, Revelation will be a piece of cake. But most of us, we don't read our Old Testament as much as we probably should, and all these books are kind of weird, right? We get weird visions and stuff in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So like one detail that I'm starting to notice as I'm entering into my own biblical studies is that in Revelation there's a moment where John is seeing the divine throne of God. And some of the descriptions mix what Isaiah and Ezekiel said together. They put them together. It's like, okay, so Isaiah saw these things, and Ezekiel saw this, so we're just going to kind of take details from each and make one big picture. It's like, what is going on here? So it is a incredibly difficult book. If you've never read your Bible, don't start here. Don't start at the end. Read the whole thing through, then try to tackle that book. All right, so that's what your Bible is. Now we're going to be talking about what textual criticism is. This topic specifically, I'm going to be leaving to a lot of smarter people. So we're going to be watching a few videos on smart people talk about this. And in fact, people who are specifically one expert in the field. He's probably the most well-known, Daniel Wallace. So we'll get to him. And here's a quote by him. So what is textual criticism? It is the study of the copies of any written document for the primary purpose of determining the exact wording of the original. Okay? So what is this? Well, we have copies, and we don't have the original documents. And that's something he'll talk about in a second when we watch this video. We don't have the original documents of the New Testament. Specifically, his focus is on the New Testament. We don't have the originals, but we have a massive amount of copies. And by looking at all those copies, we can work together all the way to the exact wording of the original. Okay? So before I go and we play the video, which we're about to do in a second, I do want to make one thing clear about the argument I'm giving tonight. The argument I'm about to be giving through textual criticism, or I guess these guys are going to be giving the argument, through textual criticism and then through the historical criteria, is going to be solely focused on the New Testament. I'm not going to be addressing the Old. The argument that I'm going to give for why I think we only as Christians need to address the New Testament is, if Jesus rose from the dead, and we are able to say there's historical certainty to this, right? If Jesus did actually rise from the dead, then we could perhaps maybe believe what some of the things he said. And if we can believe the things he said, he quotes the Old Testament. And we have Old Testament manuscripts from his day and from before. So if Jesus affirms the Old Testament and Jesus is an actual figure within history and actually did rise from the dead, we have reason to trust him. So that's why I'm going to only be addressing the New Testament through these arguments. But we'll have some question time after if you're curious about some of my argument process and things like that. So we're going to be watching the video by a textual critic himself, Daniel Wallace, Theological Seminary. So here we go.
We do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. C.J. Werleman, Jesus Lied, page 41. In today's world, the integrity of the Bible is in question. People used to ask, is it true? But now they ask, is that what the Bible really said? What I want to do now is to give you reasons for confidence in the scriptures. So, do we still have the original manuscripts of the New Testament? In short, no, we do not. These original manuscripts, all written on fragile papyri, the ancient world's paper, were handed over and over again to scribes who copied them all the way up until perhaps the end of the 2nd century. So many times that the papyri would have worn out. Now this may sound alarming, but it doesn't make the Bible untrustworthy. If we want to understand New Testament reliability, there are 4 questions that we need to ask. The first question to think about is, how many textual variants are there? Well, there's about 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament. And the best estimate today is that there's 500,000 textual variants, or a little over 3.5 variants per word in the Greek New Testament. Now these numbers seem astronomical when considering these ancient manuscripts, but let's talk about 2 key factors: quantity and time. The reason that we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. Consider other ancient authors. The average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. And if you were to stack them up, they would be no more than about 4 feet high. And the earliest copies of their works typically date more than half a millennium after they were written. Consider now the New Testament manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts are only decades from the originals. And if you were to stack every copy of every New Testament manuscript that we have on top of each other, it would be more than 1.25 miles high. So if we're going to be skeptical about the New Testament, and we were to apply that same skepticism to other ancient Greco-Roman literature, we would just be plunged right back into the Dark Ages. What we really have is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament text. Question 2. What kinds of variants are there? Of the 500,000 or so variants that we have, more than 99% of them make no difference at all. If a word is spelled incorrectly, that counts as a variant. But there were no dictionaries in the ancient world, and words would be spelled in a variety of ways, even by the same author, many times. Word order also in Greek is a matter of emphasis rather than a matter of meaning, like it is in English, because Greek's a highly inflected language. So you can change the word order without changing the meaning. What we need to focus on are the 1/5 of 1% textual variants that actually affect things. This group is both meaningful and vital. That's what I mean by the 1/5 of 1%. They affect the meaning, and they have the possibility of going back to the original. For example, in Mark chapter 9, Jesus is telling his disciples why they couldn't cast out a particular demon. He says this kind can only come out by prayer. Other manuscripts we have found finish the verse by adding the phrase, and fasting. This variant has implications on Christian practice, but not on doctrine. It's important, but it's not that important. Question 3. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? When examining the deity of Christ, we understand that the Bible claims that Jesus is God. But Dan Brown argues in the Da Vinci Code that this belief originated from Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Well, let's look at the evidence. The papyrus known as P66, which is a manuscript of John's Gospel and dated almost 150 years prior to the Council of Nicaea, clears this issue off the table with its affirmation of Jesus' deity in chapter 1. In fact, there's not a single manuscript in any language written at any time that denies the deity of Christ in John 1:1. Well, that's the deity of Christ. What about some other Christian beliefs? What about his virgin birth? What about the resurrection? Is Jesus really raised from the dead? Does the New Testament actually affirm that? And here's the thing I want to say. That even though some manuscripts may not affirm those doctrines in every single place, we have no manuscript that has any credibility to it that denies any essential Christian belief. And finally, question 4. Is the Bible that we have today what they wrote then? In all particulars, we don't know. It's probably not identical. But in all essentials, yes. What we have today in all essentials is the very Word of God. No essential Christian belief is jeopardized by any viable variant.
All right, give me just a second. All right. You guys didn't know you're going to be doing math tonight, right? I'll do it for you, don't worry. So he gave a few numbers there, and I want us to do the math just to kind of get an idea of what we're looking at here. So out of the textual variance that we have, which is about 500,000, he said that only 1/5 of 1%, which is 0.2, are actual viable variants, okay? Which equates to, does anyone know the answer off the top of their head? 1,000, yes. So, write that. All right, so that means we have 1,000 viable variants. That means something that actually pertains to a Christian belief or practice, right? So now I want to give a few numbers real quick, just so that we also see another element of the scale of textual criticism, okay? I'll put a line right there. So this is how many manuscripts of the New Testament we have in Greek alone. 5,800. But that's not our only amount of manuscripts that we have. We have approximately about 20,000 additional manuscripts written in other languages. The New Testament was translated almost immediately in other languages, right? So the New Testament is written in Greek, but what if the people in Egypt who are reading maybe Coptic want to know it? Well, then they translate it into Coptic. And those manuscripts get fit under this category, which means we have about 26,000 manuscripts of the New Testament. And out of those 26,000 manuscripts, only 1,000 of them have something that might alter a belief or practice, and none of them change an essential Christian doctrine. Am I making any sense here? Nods of approval? You have a question?
So where does the 500,000 come from?
So this is the...
About 25,000?
Yes. The textual variants are everything that's different between two manuscripts, or between all the manuscripts. So in Greek, this actually comes from Nathaniel Bouwens himself. You can say the sentence, John loves Mary, and you can write it 80 different ways, using different spellings of John, different spellings of Mary, different word ordering, different forms of love. 80 different ways for the very simple sentence, John loves Mary. You can have 80 variants for that one simple little sentence. So 500,000 is the amount of textual variants that we have in our Greek manuscripts, which is about 26,000. Okay? So we have 5,000. We'll call them, they're variants. A lot of these are just small errors. You make a spelling mistake, variant. You put a letter in a slightly different location, variant. Nathaniel Bouwens actually wrote his dissertation on what's called the movable nu. Nu is one of the Greek letters, and how it can move within a given sentence. Like that's all of those are textual variants, right? So textual variants, we may have 500,000. The next video will say 400,000. The numbers change a little bit, but I'm running with a high amount of numbers, assuming we have extra. But only 1/5 of 1% actually pertain to a Christian belief or practice. And that's crazy. That's 1,000 out of 500,000 actually could change anything. And we have 1,000 within the 26,000 manuscripts that we have, which is incredibly small. I mean, we have such a great amount of manuscripts, it's insane. He gave the example, in the next video we'll also be using a lot of Nathaniel Bouwens' argument, discussing how many manuscripts the average Greco-Roman author would have if you were to stack them up. And I love this example because the average manuscripts a Greco-Roman author would have, like maybe Plato, right? About 4.5 feet high. You stack the New Testament, you get about 1.25 miles. We have a stupid amount of manuscripts, and it's amazing for us to gain the exact wording of what the original said. Question?
So when my Bible says we use the Novum Testamentum Grace, 27th edition, edited by Nestle and Eland. They use like one of your Bible says in its preface, we use these.
What a lot of those are is going to be, so we have a lot of manuscripts, but a translator does not look at 26,000 manuscripts to translate one sentence of the New Testament. That would take a really, really long time. So what you have people like Nathaniel Bouwens. He's a textual critic. What he does is he goes through a lot of these manuscripts, see if any of these variants are actually more viable than what our current consensus is. He checks by looking at the date of the manuscript and other various details. He'll look to see if any of them are viable. And then what he does is he helps compile a text of what we think the Greek New Testament was. This is all in Greek. And then what the translators do is they take that text and then they translate from it. And that text, right, that they translate in English to us from is what Nathaniel Bouwens is helping create by doing textual criticism. Does that make sense?
So this textual base for the manuscript, it's like this composition of all these manuscripts. They
Exactly.
create a New Testament.
Exactly.
Basically based on the best manuscripts.
Yes. So they use the best manuscripts to compile one document of what they think the original had, and then then the translators come and they translate that into English. All right? Yes, Joe?
What's the cutoff here for when you stop counting?
I believe it's 1,200. It might be 1,300, but a lot of these are later manuscripts, right? So if we look at it, a lot of our manuscripts are not going to be from the 1st century. We have a few from the 1st century, which is incredible. But the next video, we'll be talking a little bit about the dating between manuscripts, just a little bit. So why don't we actually go into that video. You'll notice this video takes a lot of the information that Nathaniel Bouwens said and makes it look nice and easy to see in graphs and various things. Okay? So this is to help digest the last video in which you're just hearing him talk. Now you can see some stuff. All right, let's go ahead and start with this.
Is today's New Testament the same as the original that was written 2,000 years ago? Or has the original been hopelessly lost? After all, not one of the original manuscripts still exists. New Testament critic Bart Ehrman asks, what good is it to say that the original writings of the New Testament were inspired? We don't have the originals. We have only error-ridden copies, and the vast majority of these are centuries removed from the originals and different from them, evidently in thousands of ways. There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. If we can't trust the New Testament, we can't trust what we think we know about Jesus of Nazareth, and there's no such thing as authentic Christianity. Let's look at this more closely. The New Testament, and all significant literature from the ancient world, is reconstructed into its original form by comparing manuscript copies that have survived. To determine the reliability of this reconstruction, historians ask 3 questions. How many copies exist? How long is the time gap between when the original was written and when the earliest surviving copy was made? And how significant are the differences between the copies? The experts have more confidence in their reconstruction of the original text when there are lots of copies to work with, the time gap is short, and the differences are relatively insignificant. Historians are confident they have reconstructed the original works of Plato and Homer with a high degree of accuracy. So let's compare these works to the New Testament. We have 219 copies of Plato, 2,300 copies of Homer, but when it comes to the New Testament, we have an overwhelming 5,700 manuscript copies in the original Greek alone. In comparison with the average ancient Greek author, the New Testament copies are well over 1,000 times more plentiful. If the average size manuscript were 2½ inches thick, all the copies of the works of the average Greek author would stack up 4 feet high, while the copies of the New Testament would stack up to over 1 mile high. This is indeed an embarrassment of riches. But how much time elapsed between the original writings and the earliest surviving manuscript copy? 1,300 years passed before the first surviving copy of Plato was written, and only 400 years for Homer. How about the New Testament? Just 35 years. In the world of ancient literature, this is a blink of an eye. The wealth of material that is available for determining the wording of the original New Testament is absolutely stunning. But these manuscripts are not identical. In fact, they contain roughly 400,000 differences. The obvious question then is, how significant are these variations? Most of them are simply variations in spelling, which are easy to sort out. Then we find minor differences, such as the use of synonyms or a definite article with a proper name. These have no effect on translation. There are also errors that scholars have determined were not in the original text. That means that less than 1% of all the variants have any real significance at all for the meaning of the original text. And none of these, not one, affects a single core doctrine of the Christian faith. Furthermore, in their various writings, early church leaders quoted the New Testament over 1 million times. So extensive are these citations that if all the other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. The overabundance of early and accurate manuscripts and quotations from those manuscripts combined to make reconstruction of the original Greek text of the New Testament virtually certain. The books of the New Testament you read today are the same as the original writings penned nearly 2,000 years ago.
Oh, all right. So, does that help it make a little bit more sense when you can see fancy pictures and graphs and things? Make it a little easier. What's up?
This Greek New Testament that
Yeah.
the authors of the ESV used to translate into Greek, do they try to take the oldest manuscripts they can with the least amount of differences? They don't use the ones from like 1000 AD.
Yeah, so what textual critics can find is that if they find a variant, let's say in a manuscript from 1000 AD, they can usually, because we have so many manuscripts, track back to when that original mistake or change occurred. They do use the oldest manuscripts possible that are still viable. And the reason that they have to consider it viable is it still similar with what else we have with history, with our other manuscripts. So they don't always necessarily use the oldest one, although the older, the better.
So the Novum Testamentum Grace, or however you pronounce it, is usually they try to go for as old as possible.
Yes.
Close to the,
So you want to go as old as possible because you want the least amount of time in between when the original was written and when this copy was written. You want coherency, so you want that manuscript that's old to also agree with our newer ones. That helps affirm that our newer ones are. So I don't have the exact numbers on here, but let me see if I can do it off the top of my head. Do you know how old of a manuscript the King James was translated from? There's a difference between the old and new. What was that?
It was translated from several. I believe it was
About 7 manuscripts, if I remember correctly. I've heard all the way up to...
the earliest one was from the year 400s. Around.
Incorrect. I believe the earliest, if I remember correctly, dated from, I want to say, 1100. So we're talking the King James used incredibly old, or I should say more recent manuscripts, right? So we're using incredibly more recent manuscripts, yet is the King James still...
400 years before it was written. That was
Yeah. This is 11 years after it was written. You said 400 years, from the date of the King James?
Yeah.
Oh, then yes, that's correct. Sorry. So King James, the first translation came out in 1611. And so what Liam was saying is 400 years from that, before that, which would take us to about 1200s, which is very close to around the time. We're talking about 1,000 years after Jesus lived. The manuscripts that were written in that day and age is what the King James used. And yet the King James was still incredibly accurate compared to it. It's had a few revisions, a few fixing of a little mistakes here and there as we now have older manuscripts. But it's crazy to think that our King James from 1611 is still incredibly reliable when it comes to getting very close to the exact wording in the New Testament. So yeah, do we have any other questions on textual criticism? Because we're about to move to our next topic. What's up?
How many of our modern English Bible translations rely on the same Greek New Testament?
What do you mean by that? So the same compiled Greek New Testament?
Yes, like you know,
I do not know off the top of my head
or like,
directly.
like among a certain generation of, because the ESV has gone through revisions.
Mm-hmm. Every Bible translation has.
Like, wouldn't you want to use the same manuscript, and then the only difference would be an English translation?
Yeah, so the edits and the revisions that happen is most of the time when a translator says, I think we can word that better. I think we can give a better idea for the English reader who doesn't know Greek or Hebrew. We can give them a better idea of what that actually was saying. So that's what most of the editions, the later editions are. The King James did have to go through a few like one-word changes. So I believe an example was in Revelation, there's a phrase, it was it either the book of life or the tree of life? That's how small of a detail we're discussing here. That's what a major change that the King James had to do. That's a very, very small change because they pretty much mean very closely to the same. On textual criticism, is everyone rather clear on this idea? We have now gotten to a point where our manuscript that we have of the New Testament is probably exactly what the originals had. We don't have 100% certainty, but we have like 99.5% certainty, which is really good. Do we have any other questions on that? All right, moving on. We're going to look at one of my favorite arguments for the reliability of that actually text itself is part of the 4 historical criteria. Now, let me explain something. Textual criticism tells us that these documents were written in this day and probably said these things. It's increasing our probability and our reliability on what the text said. This next argument is going to be on, is the text actually what happened? Okay, so we're going to be looking at the mind of the authors who are writing the New Testament. And we're going to be saying, are they actually writing something that corresponds to history, or are they making up a story? Right? So we may have textual criticism of the Iliad, which actually has the strongest textual criticism right after the New Testament. And we looked at, that was the Homer example, with around like 2,300 manuscripts, and they date 400 years after original, the earliest that we have at least. But that we may have strong textual criticism to say that these are the very words of Homer. But is what Homer is writing actually correspond to history? That's the next big question we have to ask. And specifically, we're asking it, of course, on the Bible. So, yes, so that was the distinction I was just now making. So we also have, I guess this is a slight variation, the reliability of authorship, who actually wrote it, and we also have reliability of content. Is this content correspond with history? We're going to be focusing a lot more on the content than on trying to figure out who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. From tradition, it says, well, Matthew, the Apostle Matthew. But that's not going to be the focus of tonight, trying to prove who wrote what books. It's going to be more focused on, is what they wrote actually correspond to history? All right. So here are the 4. They're big, fancy historical terms, because you can use this on any document. I'm going to do my best to boil them down to simple concepts. I also have a few hopefully funny memes in there that correspond to some of these. So here you go. You can look at the memes. One of these things is not like the other. So this is the concept of dissimilarity, something that is not similar. So the criteria of dissimilarity denotes that a given detail within a document is more probable if this detail is not what we would have expected them to write. So if we expect an author to write about XYZ and they decide to write about something very, very different, that actually has more probability of being true. An example that blurs onto the next one, because they use similar arguments for them, onto the next criteria, would be like if a Roman historian were to write, remember these are chosen a lot of times by Roman governors or even the Caesar himself, and these historians, what they say would have to get the seal of approval from the authorities. That, yeah, you can write this down. So if we have a historian who's saying, all right, so in the battle of this, in this place, in this date, we got utterly destroyed. Our enemies crushed us, we lost thousands and thousands of men, and we failed terribly. That's different than what we'd expect them to write, right? We'd expect them to write something that is like, and we destroyed our enemies, and it was amazing and fantastic, and we won so really, really well. it's different than what we expect. So I want to look at a few examples that we find within the Gospels that use this technique, or this argument, I should say. So first we're going to look at the concept of Messiah, and we have a few other ones. So let's start with there. In ancient Judaism, right, in Jesus' time, this Judaism of Jesus' time, the concept of Messiah was very different than our concept of Messiah today. The concept of Messiah was that Israel was in exile. They were not in authority of their own government. They were ruled by other nations, these tyrants that they wanted off their backs so that they could rule a nation. And their scriptures talked about a servant of the Lord, an individual who would come in, who would destroy these tyrants over Israel, and who would raise up a kingdom that would last forever and ever. So what did the people of Jesus' time expect the Messiah to be? This great warrior king. Then they wrote about Jesus. And Jesus is not this great warrior king. He comes onto the scene saying, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He says anyone who lives by the sword will die by the sword. He's not exactly teaching, hey, we should go kill the Romans. He's actually saying, no, actually give Caesar back his money and his authority because we don't care about it, but give God what is God's, which is yourself. And so that goes into our second one. When the teachings of Jesus, Jesus taught something radically different than the concept of the Messiah. So this is an example of the dissimilarity because this is different than what we expect them to have written. Another example, the crucifixion. Great example of dissimilarity. So if you think that the coming Messiah is going to tear down Rome, is going to set up this great, powerful empire, and your Messiah gets crucified. Now, what is crucifixion? We have some conception nowadays, because most of us, I think, in the room are Christian, and we've heard of this concept of crucifixion. But a detail that we don't typically always hear is that it was the most shameful way to die in a Roman society. Crucifixion was only given to those who had done the worst of the worst crimes. If you had stolen something, you might get your hands cut off or beaten up or spend some time in a jail. But if you killed someone, you might be facing this, crucifixion. It was the most shameful way and one of the most painful ways to die. And so if you have this Messiah, this warrior king who's going to go and destroy the Romans, and now he's up on a cross, dying the most shameful way known to these people, that's not what we expect. And that's the argument of dissimilarity. It's not what we expect. The last one is the resurrection. The Jewish people had this. They're like, okay, people are going to rise from the dead. Well, how? Well, the conception was at the end of times when God is like, all right, we're going to make a little cut off here and start a new section of this, right, of this world, a little cut and tie. And God would come and he would raise everyone from the dead and judge everyone. So the resurrection was reserved for everyone. So everyone would rise from the dead at one point in time. Yet Jesus rises from the dead way before that moment happens. They were not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead when their conception was that everyone would rise from the dead. If Jesus rose from the dead, then everyone else should be rising from the dead. Yet that didn't happen. Only Jesus rose from the dead, except for the people that Jesus rose from the dead. And so the concept of even resurrection was different than what we expect them to be writing about. So this is the argument of dissimilarity. Any questions on this? Does this make sense? Okay. This one, the criteria of embarrassment. We've got when you walk into the wrong class on the first day of school, just walking out of there. This one might be a little hard to see. It's from your waiter. Enjoy your meal. Me. You too. So some embarrassing moments possibly that we've all experienced. So the criteria of embarrassment is focused on the idea, right? It denotes that a given detail within a document is more probable if the detail would have been embarrassing to the author. That's the key. If it's embarrassing to the author, or specifically, I maybe should have written a little bit more here, to the author's group they're a part of. That could be your family, that could be your nation, that could be any group. That could be Ratio Christi, if you're part of Ratio Christi, right? If you're going to write embarrassing details about Ratio Christi, you're making fun of your own group, right? Something you're a part of. And so what we find in the Gospels is we have embarrassing details. First one I want to talk about is a story that hopefully all of you have heard of. I find it kind of funny almost. It's rather sad a little bit. But so the fire from heaven story. So in Luke 9, verse 51 through 56, Jesus and his disciples are traveling through Samaria, right? Ancient enemies of the Israelites, although they were once actually Israelites, and they're now just kind of fighting with them, and there's some animosity, and they don't like them. So Jesus and the disciples are walking along through some Samaritan towns. They're preaching, and some Samaritans don't like them. They're like, oh, get these Jews out of here, right? There's accounts of possibly throwing rocks. There's yelling and screaming. They're like, get out of here. They're being mean. And so what do the disciples do? Well, we're going to protract the Messiah. So they go up. They go, Master, Master, should we call down fire from heaven and destroy them? And Jesus is like, no, you're not supposed to do that. Come on. You've not been hearing anything that I've been saying, right? The idea of this story is the disciples are absolutely failing. They misunderstand the situation. They misunderstand the teachings of their master, the person they've been living with. Got a little detail in there?
Some manuscripts add, and he said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are. You do not know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man did not come to instruct people's lives, but to save them.
So yeah, with this story, the disciples are failing. So if this is written by Luke, right, that's the account here. Luke was immediately taught by Paul, who is in the group of what we call Christians. And so now he's making fun of the very people who walked and lived with Jesus, his people, the people, his authorities of that day, in a lot of cases. So this is an embarrassing detail that Luke adds in there. So is it more reliable? Well, it is, in the sense that why are you going to embarrass yourself for no reason? You're more likely to embarrass yourself because you're actually writing down what actually happened. You're not likely, if you're going to make up a story, to write about here's how I failed or here's how my friends failed, right? And you associate with them. So the next two details are a lot more common when it comes to this argument. I just wanted to add that one because I think it's kind of fun. Fire from heaven, which if you guys don't know, that's lightning. Usually that's understood to be because it starts fires and it comes from heaven and it's big and loud and strong. All right, so let's talk about women and in Jesus' day. The conception of women was very different than our conception of women today. That culture was very sexist. We got to get that out of the way. We have to understand that. It just was. All right? So in that culture, these are some references to the women at the tomb specifically. But in that culture, women their testimony in a court of law was worth nothing. So if a woman saw a crime and they went and they reported it to the authorities go, okay, go on your day. Because a woman's testimony in that day and age was worth nothing. A man's testimony was worth something, and that's where you get the sexism, right? So if you're going to make up a story and you want to convince people by this story, and you want to go, okay, I need to get as many people to believe this fictional story that I'm writing. The very first people to see Jesus rise from the dead were women. No, if you're making the story up, you'd put men, because men's testimony in that culture actually are worth something. But no, the authors, every single gospel has women at the tomb. They're the first ones to see the tomb empty, and in many of the accounts, see Jesus risen from the dead. They're the first ones. That makes no sense in this society. It's an embarrassing detail because it doesn't fit with what we expect them, so it's dissimilar too. It also fits that category. But it's also embarrassing because if you're going to convince your enemies, right, the people who dislike your religion, that Jesus rose from the dead, they'll make fun of you that women were the ones who were the first to see Jesus. In that day and age, at least. In our day and age, we recognize that, oh wait, women are equal with men, right? We recognize, and we've moved on from a lot of our sexist ways, right? Which is good and great. But in that culture, it would be an embarrassing detail. The last one is crucifixion. Whoops, I'm knocking things over now. Crucifixion, just like how it is dissimilar, it is also embarrassing because it's shameful. It's not what we expected them to write, but not only that, it's incredibly shameful for their God and Messiah to die the most shameful way. It's an embarrassing detail. It's something you probably wouldn't want to tell people, yet they tell it because they believe it to be good news. If you're making up a story, you don't write something that's embarrassing. You write something that everyone is going to agree with. And so this No, not everyone did. Our next criteria, real quick I should say, any questions on that? It's very similar to dissimilarity, but it's slightly different. Do you guys get the nuance there? Okay. All right, big fancy words. Criteria of multiple attestation. That just means multiple sources, multiple people attesting to what happened. So this criteria of multiple attestation denotes that a given detail within a document is more probable if the detail is claimed by other documents from its time. I have a little note here as well. The more documents that claim this event or detail, the more probable that it becomes. If you witness an event, you and maybe 50 other people, and all 50 people agree, who are all separate, write down a testimony of what they think happened, and you compile it together, and you see that everyone agrees, that's way more reliable than one person telling you their story, right? If 50 people agree, or if 5 people agree even. And so when it comes to our New Testament, we have a few individuals. These are just a small list currently of a lot of early dates. So these are their lives. This is how long Josephus lived, from 37 AD to 100 AD, right? So Jesus was crucified and resurrected at around 30 AD, to get you an idea of how early these sources are. These were all people from the 1st to 2nd century, or a collection that has a few writings that mention Jesus. Some of them are Jesus followers. So Clement I, the Catholics in the room would say, well, that's Pope Clement I. But a few of these aren't fully believers of Jesus. Josephus is a weird example because he's Jewish. But he's a Jewish historian writing for the Romans. So the Romans have to okay the history that he's writing. But he's also Jewish. And what's kind of weird about some of his stuff is some of the manuscripts of Josephus, when they write about Jesus, Josephus seems to say, Jesus is the Messiah, and he resurrected. And so we find a few other manuscripts that say, where Josephus is like, maybe he did. And so those are typically treated as more reliable, because for him to outright say that Jesus rose from the dead is for him to be Christian rather than Jewish. So there's some details, and the historical criteria that we're going through also has to be done on these guys' work if we're going to use this argument. But what we do find is that they all mention Jesus. Many of them mention his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and some other details. Yes?
So attestation outside of a source is one of the criteria. How is it not infinite recursion? Because for every source, then there's going to have to also have outside sources that have outside sources that are.
Well, this is why it's not one criteria, but 4. And there's actually argument that you can have 5 or 6 and things like that. So this criteria must be used with the other criteria. So you look at a document and say we have 5 different documents by different authors. Each of them claim the same event. We then use dissimilarity, embarrassment, and potentially other arguments, which I'll show a few other arguments that people can make. And we use those to say, okay, we think these are very probable. They all also attest to one event. That means they're even more reliable. If you find 5 sources and they all seem to be reliable in a few of the other categories, they potentially are even more reliable in this category. Does that make sense? So you don't just use this one, you need to use the other criteria as well.
I know, like you would use the other criteria, but what prevents you from just going an infinite list of sources?
What do you mean an infinite source?
These sources for Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian of Samosata, you'd have to use the other 3 as well. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
When you're verifying the sources, verifying your source.
And remember that these criteria do not guarantee a actual event. These criteria give us higher probability of an event.
It's inductive, not deductive.
Exactly. We're going for congruency, for the fancy terms of the logic, those who've taken a logic class. Cogency, excuse me. We're looking for cogency, not a guaranteed conclusion. And so because it's history, we can't get guaranteed conclusions, but we can get congruency, or cogency, gosh dang it. So we have some people who've also said that Jesus died at least, or at least lived, minimally. So these are some people that at least are attesting to Jesus' existence. Let's go to our next one. Our last historical criteria is the criteria of historical congruence, or congruency. The criteria of historical congruence denotes that a given detail within a document is more probable if this detail seems to fit with our current understanding of history. The idea of this one is that I give a fun example down here. Hypothetically, a document is found, and it tells an event where Prince Ali visited Sultan Hamid Bouwens of Agrabah to ask for his daughter Jasmine's hand in marriage. All right, some of you already know what I'm doing here. Some of you are like, huh, what? Prince Ali is also known as Aladdin, right? But let's say this is an ancient document that we find that claims these events. We use this principle to determine if it's reliable. And this is how we use the principle. Do we know of a Prince Ali? Well, there's actually been a few princes with the name Ali. They usually have other parts to the name, so we're maybe unsure about it. Ali was a very common one because I believe that was Muhammad's nephew, I think it was? Yes.
It was Muhammad's nephew and would have been the second in line for succession.
Exactly. And so Prince Ali, maybe we have a Prince Ali that this could be referring to. Sultan Hamid Bouwens II. We got nothing. We got absolutely nothing for this kind of guy. So that right there should give us a red flag. We have no information to say that this person even existed. So is this fictional? Maybe. Well, let's look at other details. Agrabah. That does not exist. And so as far as we can tell, we have no evidence of a place named Agrabah. So most likely, even just with those details, we can say this is probably fictional, right? And our last detail, Jasmine, the name there, doesn't really tell us anything because we'd need a lot more than just Jasmine to tell us much. And especially because we don't know who Sultan Hamid Bouwens II is. We don't know about his daughter either. And so what we find is that if we were to find a document that said this from, let's say, the 1st century, we wouldn't trust it just because we don't have all the details. And so, yes, so this is a few pointers that I give. This one can be in a lot of depth. You can give a lot of details for this. But this is just a few examples. We're going to go through 2 examples, specifically Caesarea Philippi and Pontius Pilate. Noah told me to keep the archaeology to a minimum. So we're going through 2. Hopefully that's okay.
Why don't you dig deep?
That's because we have someone else who's going to be talking about biblical archaeology. So I figured 2 is pretty minimum for me because there's so many great details out there. Specifically, tons of places. The New Testament records tons of locations that are actual places that we find in reality. No Agrabahs, but we find actual places that exist. And we'll look at Caesarea Philippi in just a second. The other detail is that we have the emperors and rulers. The New Testament correctly identifies governors of Palestine and various Caesars who are ruling in Rome. So Luke might say, in the reign of Tiberius, this happened. And we know, hey, wait, there was a Tiberius. Hey, that corresponds to a person who's in actual history. So specifically, we're going to be looking at Pontius Pilate, who in fact, I'll get to that in just a moment. This is one of my favorite parts, just because I love his history and pictures. So here's a place. This is Caesarea Philippi, also known as the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades. Some of the nearby civilizations were also known with this title. Why? Well, the fun history about this place, whoops, I hit the wrong button. The fun history about this place is down here in this cave, little section here, you would have massive amounts of shrines to various deities. So the Israelites, who don't worship those gods, would view this as a pretty bad place. There's also a book called Enoch, which many of you probably have heard of, that was commonly read in Jesus' time. We actually have a quotation from Enoch in our Bible. It's in Jude. And Enoch talks about how this place, it was Caesarea Philippi, was where the Watchers came down. And for those who know Enoch, this is the place. So essentially in Jewish conception, this is the place where like Satan himself came and fell down to the earth kind of idea and is chilling. So why does this matter for our discussion of the Gospels? Well, we have a story in Matthew 16 and in Mark 8 where Jesus and the disciples traveled to Caesarea Philippi. And we have a few stories here. One story is Jesus goes up to his disciples and say, "Who do the people say I am?" And some of them say, "Well, maybe you're Elijah. Maybe you're this. Maybe you're that." "Well, who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Son of the living God, the Messiah." And Jesus then says, we have this famous quote right here that you probably will recognize if I cannot butcher it. Jesus says that this information was given to you by the Father. This was not of yourself. And And he says, you are Petros, or Peter. This is where we get the name Peter. Peter means rock. Like, rock. And on this rock, what rock? Well, possibly somewhere near here. This is only one of the only high places nearby. And on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not stand against it, will not be able to overcome it, cannot withstand it. What is he saying here? Hey, yeah, we're going to stand in Satan's domain. We're going to walk into Satan's house. And Jesus is like, yeah, it's right here. Yeah, in Satan's house. This is where I'm going to start building my church. And yeah, all of the gates of hell, the gates to the underworld, they got nothing on me. When we know our historical context, passages come alive. And that's one of the things I love, because this is an actual place. You can go to this place today, which is I just think it's so cool. Yes?
Please tell me there's a church nearby.
I'm sure there is. Although I think it would be very interesting if there wasn't. But let's get to our next detail, which is on Pontius Pilate. The interesting thing about Pontius Pilate is we don't have much history for him, or at least we didn't. We didn't really know if he existed. We had, I think it was Tacitus who may have mentioned him. We'll go, okay, and the Gospels mention him, but we don't have really any evidence for a governor in Judea. Until in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago, a stone was found in Caesarea Maritima. Two different places, Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea Maritima. Maritima, you can think of what is the word I'm looking for? Ocean. What was that? Words.
Maritime.
Maritime. Yes, the idea of ocean is Maritima is based off, this is the Sea of Galilee you see in the picture back there, the water there. Regardless, this is by the ocean, or the sea, I should say, not the ocean. This is by the Sea of Galilee. Specifically, you see the structure back here. This is the site of the governor's palace over Palestine. So this is where if there was a Pontius Pilate, he would have ruled right here. He's got this beautiful palace right on the Sea of Galilee, and it's actually really cool. Also, one of my teachers, actually here, Dr. Lindsay, has talked about how Caesarea Maritima was also what he called a cash cow, because there was a natural harbor here. And so when the winter months would come and there would be a lot less fishing, people would put their boats there, and they would say, oh yeah, you can store your boat here for 4 months, but it'll cost you a little money. And so this was the ruling location for where Pontius Pilate would have lived. And so as they're excavating this location, they find this. It's a really interesting and fascinating stone. Now you'll notice half of this stone, right there to all to the left, has been completely scratched. I'm going to leave it on the floor because I'm going to do it again. It's going to happen. Does anyone know why it was scratched off? Do you know why?
It doesn't look like erosion.
It's not. This is a man-made scratching off. This chipping of the stone was done by humans. Do you have an idea?
Didn't Pontius Pilate, if I remember, kind of go insane and kind of get shunned because he went insane?
I do not know of that specifically. It does not necessarily relate to this. So, in ancient history, it was very common, as they don't have a lot of the technology that we have to easily take stones from one place and move it to another. These stones, and every stone here, was incredibly valuable for building structures. So when the palace was destroyed at some point within history, because this happens everywhere, every building gets destroyed at some point, the people who came to this site next and decided, we're going to build this, or whatever it is, they would take stones from the nearby area, and they would carve and chip away to the stone to fit properly into a wall or a floor. So this stone itself, this was a human-done thing. They chipped off this stone so that it could be used as a building block, a building stone for a new wall, a new castle, whatever it was, a new palace. Yet, what's so fascinating about history is just barely, if you look at the stone close enough, right up here, you can see Tiberium. Oh, we know an emperor named Tiberius. And I believe it's in this section right here. It says Pilatus, right there. It's really hard to read. I tried to find a photo, but there wasn't one that would be able to be blown up this big and look good. That highlights the etching. But what this stone says is essentially what they gathered this stone would have said was Pontius Pilate governor of Judea, under the authority of Tiberius, Caesar of Rome. So where did this stone probably belong? And this is where currently a replica sits today. This is a replica of it. It sits at the site of the palace because this was a plaque stone, something that you would put right in front of your palace and say, hey, this is my palace. This is why I own it. Tiberius? Yeah, he said so. What's up?
So it's like getting your name on a parking space?
Yes, very much so. Or getting like a little trophy to yourself, right? You put your name on it. This is him saying, my trophy is this palace behind me. Here's my palace, right? He's just putting his name and claim on it. And to say that I have this palace because of Tiberius. That's why his name appears on there. Isn't that fascinating? We almost lost this. It would have had incredibly little evidence for Pontius Pilate. But because we have this, historians now all agree, yeah, okay, this guy existed.
So I'm guessing things written in stone are usually given a bit more credit than...
Yes.
Okay.
Manuscripts can be easily faked. Stones can even be faked. But what they did find was that this was dated to the period and found at the site of where we would expect it to be. All of the historical criteria for this document seem to fit. And because it fits with some of the other accounts of Pontius Pilate, using this idea of historical congruence, they say, because we have all of these attestations of him, and now we have something that physically was at the site we would expect it to be, they go, okay, yeah, this is pretty good. And this dates back to the 1st century.
How do
So,
they date it?
I don't know every exact detail they use. A lot of times you can use the handwriting or the style of the font. That can be used for dating. Specifically, what structure this belonged to. So a lot of times, let's say this was, for example, I don't actually know what it is, but let's say it's limestone for some reason. And after the building is destroyed, a new ruler comes in and they say, I want granite, but use some of the old stone. So they bring in a bunch of granite and they construct a new structure. Well, which one's older? Well, the one made of limestone, right? So you can deduce based off the type of stone it is sometimes. You can also, a lot of times, historians have been able to even find out where this stone would come from, where they had mined it from a rock, like what quarry it came from. There's a lot you can do there. I just don't know all the specific details. Also, we're going to take a bit of an intro
Did they do
rather than
any carbon dating?
It's quite possible. I just don't know like every detail that they use specifically for this one.
No, not carbon, but like some sort of other dating maybe.
There's quite a few dating processes. I'm just not directly familiar with them, and I would have researched them if this was a super in-depth talk. But because we're not going into dating too much of like the authors or even artifacts, I feel like I would leave it here. This is the idea of historical congruence. We have physical places that correspond to the written places. We have physical history that corresponds to the history that is given in the Gospels. So this is the idea that they're piecing together this mosaic. And the picture is Pontius Pilate existed, and there's high probability that Jesus did go. 7. Oh, cool. Well, I'm nearing the end anyway, so this works out well. Other methods of reliability, I'm going to touch on a few lightly, but not go into much detail. Minimal facts arguments are one that can be commonly used. Minimal facts arguments is a type of argument that specifically only uses details granted by the most skeptical scholars. So, to give an example of this, hopefully that everyone would understand, would be focusing on this guy named Gary Habermas. He has specifically 5 historical minimum facts that he uses. Sometimes it's 7. He says anywhere between 3 to 7 he's used for his arguments for the reliability of the Gospels. Here are 5 that were listed on one of his websites. Or I should say an article about him, not on his website. He does have a website though. First one is Jesus died by crucifixion. Second one, disciples had experience they believed to have been because of Jesus, or of the risen Jesus. Paul drastically changed his opinion on Christianity. Remember, he was an enemy of Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, changed his stance on Christianity. At one point he was doubting, and then when he saw the risen Christ, he believed. And then Jesus emptied tombs. So what he does is he says, okay, given these facts and these facts alone, let's deduce what happened. Because these are what the most skeptical scholars will give you. They'll say, yeah, all of these check out historically. That's a lot of detail, right? That's people who are like, yeah, we've seen Jesus. And they're like, maybe he had hallucinations. And he goes, really? Is a hallucination going to change someone who is killing Christians into one who's a Christian himself? Is a hallucination going to change your stance on your brother? Right? So using these details, you can get rid of a lot of common arguments, but you can also argue for the reliability of the scriptures just from these arguments, to say that Jesus did rise from the dead. Other types of arguments that can be given, there are internal arguments that can be given, undesigned consequences. Those ones are specifically where one gospel will give us a detail that is unexplained in another gospel, but is crucial to a story. So there's like one where Jesus goes and he asks Philip, when he was about to feed the 5,000, if they had money to feed the 5,000. That doesn't make any sense because Judas was the one who carried the money. So why ask Philip for the money? Well, one of the other Gospels says that they went to Bethsaida for this same story. They were near the city of Bethsaida, and that Philip is from Bethsaida. Oh, so Jesus is like, hey, do we have enough money? Because this is his hometown, right? There are these undesigned consequences that are explaining stories of details that go unexplained in one gospel, get explained because of another gospel. Does that make sense? Okay. External arguments, these are ones outside the Bible. You can look at secular sources affirming the life, death, of Jesus. That's part of the multiple attestation, but you can use that more in depth than just saying other people say it. You can actually look at what they say and try to make an argument from it. Of course, great archaeology that helps our biblical accounts, both old and new. And then there's additional historical criteria that people will give. A very common one is the criterion of Aramaism. I don't know exactly how to say that. Let's just say, what was that? Aramaisms. And this one focuses more on the idea that these were all Aramaic speakers. And in the Gospels that are written in Greek, there are Aramaic slang words that were just common words used in that day and age. Not the proper term necessarily. All right, so here's one of my finishing slides here. These are a bunch of resources that I got a lot of this information from. By no means is this everything, but this is a lot of the resources that I looked. I recommend take a picture of this. You can look at these resources. You can get a lot of information from these sources. For a lot of the arguments, Inspiring Philosophy uses a lot of the criteria as well as a lot more that I didn't ever touch on. Daniel Wallace for the textual criticism, great for that. Bible Project, because they're awesome. If you just want to learn Bible stories, they're great for that. And then also Gary Habermas if you want to look more into his minimal facts argument. Very fascinating guy. So that is pretty much where my presentation ends. I have like an ending slide, but I'm going to put it back on this just in case people want to take some more time to look at that. But that is it for me. Hopefully you guys have learned some stuff. Hopefully you've retained some stuff. And hopefully it was not too boring or dry. So thank you guys.